4,000 years. More than 40 centuries of wars, miracles, betrayals, and empires that were born and turned to dust. And at the center of it all, a single people. A people who should have disappeared dozens of times. The Egyptians tried to exterminate them. The Assyrians deported 10 of their 12 tribes to corners of the world that no one can locate this day. The Babylonians burned their temple to its foundations. The Romans razed their capital, killed more than 1 million of them in a single revolt, and scattered the survivors to the 4 corners of the earth. Hitler put 6 million of them in gas chambers. And yet, even so, they are still here. They speak the same language. They worship the same God. And they return to the same land. How does a people survive all of that? What is so different about this story that it defies all logic of human civilization? Because by the normal rules of history, Israel should not exist. No other people of antiquity survived like this. You don't see Amalekites walking around. There is no Philistine embassy. No one speaks Moabite. But Hebrew, a language that was clinically dead for 2,000 years, is spoken today by 9 million people in a country that didn't exist 80 years ago. And this entire story, from the first step to the last chapter, fits into a single timeline that begins with a man alone in the middle of the Mesopotamian desert and ends with a vision of the future so terrifying that to this day no one can fully interpret it. From Abraham to Revelation. This is the story you are about to hear. It all begins around 2000 BC, and it starts in the most unlikely place possible, not on a sacred mountain, not in a mystical cave. It begins in one of the most sophisticated and pagan cities of the ancient world, Ur of the Chaldeans, a metropolis in southern Mesopotamia where Iraq is located today. Ur had paved streets, irrigation systems, schools where mathematics was taught on clay tablets, and a ziggurat, a temple tower, dedicated to the moon god Nana, which dominated the city skyline like a brick skyscraper. We are talking about a city with about 65,000 inhabitants at a time when most of humanity lived in mud villages. And it is in this city, in the midst of this culture, that a man named Abram lives. He is not a prophet. He is not a priest. The biblical text does not say he was especially holy or righteous. Joshua 24:2 is brutally honest. It says that Abram's father Terah served other gods. Abram grew up in a polytheistic family, and it is exactly to this man, without a spiritual resume, without divine credentials, that God speaks. Genesis 12:1, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." Pay attention to what is being asked here. God doesn't say, "Go to Canaan." He doesn't give a map. He doesn't give coordinates. He says, "Go to the land I will show you." Future tense. In other words, leave everything you know and walk in the direction I will show you when I feel like it. This is a level of trust that most of us wouldn't have even for choosing a new restaurant. And Abram was around 75 years old, and he goes. He takes Sarai, his wife. He takes Lot, his nephew. He takes the servants, the flocks, and he starts walking. To the west, more than 1,000 kilometers of desert between Mesopotamia and Canaan. Weeks of travel with atoll tents, supplies, under a sun that cracked the ground and nights so cold that frost formed on the animal's wool. No road, no guarantee, nothing but a voice and a promise. And what a promise. Genesis 12:2-3, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great." Nation. God is telling a 75-year-old man without children that an entire people will come from him. Sarai was barren. Both were past the age. And God promises descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. Humanly speaking, this wasn't faith. It was madness. But here is the detail that transforms this story from a simple journey into something much greater. God is not just calling a man. He is inaugurating a project, the covenant with Abraham. because this is where Abram becomes Abraham, father of multitudes, is not a vague religious agreement. It is a contract with specific clauses: land, descendants, and blessing. Genesis 15 describes the ceremony. God tells Abraham to cut animals in half and pass between the pieces. This was an ancient Near Eastern covenant ritual. Whoever passed between the pieces was saying, "If I break this covenant, let what happened to these animals happen to me." And here comes the shock. Abraham falls asleep. And the one who passes between the pieces is God alone, in the form of a smoking firepot and a blazing torch. In other words, God assumes total responsibility for the covenant. Abraham doesn't need to fulfill anything for promise to be maintained. This is unilateral, unconditional, and it will echo through every page of the Bible from here on. If this promise impresses you, leave a like now, because this story only gets more intense from here. Abraham finally has the promised son. Isaac is born when Abraham is 100 years old and Sarah is 90. The biological miracle that no one expected. The boy grows up, and then God does something that to this day is one of the most disturbing moments in all of Scripture. Genesis 22:2, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering." God asks back for exactly what he promised: the son, the lineage, the entire future of the project. Imagine the walk, 3 days of travel to Mount Moriah, Abraham carrying the wood, the knife, the fire, and beside him the boy who is the only living proof that God keeps his promises. Isaac notices something is missing. "My father, the fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham responds with a phrase that carries the weight of all biblical theology: God himself will provide the lamb. He raises the knife, and at that exact moment, an angel holds his hand. A ram appears caught in a thicket. Isaac is spared. But Mount Moriah, remember that name, because it is exactly there, on that same mountain, that Solomon will build the Temple of Jerusalem 1,000 years later. And it is in the vicinity of that mountain that 2,000 years later, another father will deliver another son, and this time, no one will hold his hand. Isaac grows up and has twin sons, Esau and Jacob. And here the story of Israel gets its name, literally, because Jacob is a deceiver. The Bible doesn't hide this. He steals his brother's blessing. He deceives his blind father. He flees to avoid being killed. He spends 20 years working for his uncle Laban, who deceives him back. And then, one night on the banks of the Jabbok River, something inexplicable happens. A man, or was it an angel, or God himself? The text is deliberately ambiguous, wrestles hand to hand with Jacob all night. Genesis 32:28, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans, and have overcome." Israel, he who struggles with God. The name of the entire nation comes from a fight in the dark, on the banks of a river, between a deceiver and the creator of the universe. And Jacob leaves that fight limping, with a dislocated hip, but with a new name. This is the spiritual DNA of this people. It is not a people that accepts everything quietly. It is a people that struggles, questions, limps, and even so moves forward. Jacob, now Israel, has 12 sons, and those 12 sons become the 12 tribes. But before becoming a nation, this family will go through one of the most dramatic episodes of Genesis. Joseph, the second to last son, his father's favorite, is sold into slavery by his own brothers, thrown into a pit, dragged to Egypt, falsely accused by his master's wife, locked in a dungeon where the smell of urine and sweat mixed with the mold on the stone walls. And there he stays, for years, forgotten, until Pharaoh has a dream that no one can interpret. 7 fat cows devoured by 7 thin cows. 7 full heads of grain swallowed by 7 withered heads. Joseph is taken out of prison, interprets the dream. 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of devastating famine. And in a twist that only the biblical narrative can make seem natural, the Hebrew slave becomes the second most powerful man in Egypt, governor, administrator of the entire grain reserve. And when the famine hits Canaan, who appears bowing before him asking for food? The same brothers who threw him into the pit, they don't recognize him, but he recognizes every face. And here, instead of revenge, Joseph chooses something that goes against all human logic: forgiveness. Genesis 50:20 summarizes it all. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. Jacob's entire family goes down to Egypt, 70 people. Genesis 46:27 is precise with the number. They settle in the land of Goshen, a fertile region in the Nile Delta, and for a time, all is well. Joseph is powerful. Pharaoh is an ally. The Hebrews prosper. But here enters one of the most brutal transitions in the entire Bible. Exodus 1:8. A single sentence that changes everything. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. One sentence, one generation. And from protected guests, the Hebrews become slaves. The new Pharaoh looks at that people who were multiplying too fast and feel fear, political fear, demographic fear, and his solution is terrifying: forced labor, inhuman conditions, and, when that wasn't enough to stop the growth, infanticide. Exodus 1:22. Every Hebrew boy born was to be thrown into the Nile. Imagine what that meant in daily life: women hiding their pregnancies, births in silence in the middle of the night, mothers holding back tears while drowning the pain of handing their children over to the river. Egypt, which had been a refuge, became a slaughterhouse. And this was not a short episode. The Hebrews stayed in Egypt for 430 years. Exodus 12:40 is exact: 430 years. To give you an idea, that is more time than Brazil has existed as a country. Entire generations were born, lived, and died knowing nothing but mud bricks, whips, and the scorching sun over Pharaoh's construction sites. And it is in the midst of this horror that a mother places her baby in a papyrus basket, coated with tar and pitch, and sets it adrift on the Nile, not to kill him, but in a desperate gamble that the current would take him somewhere safe. Pharaoh's daughter finds basket. The baby is crying, and she, the Egyptian princess, decides to raise him as her own. The name? Moses, drawn out of the water. If you believe that God writes history in the most unlikely details, comment, God is sovereign. Because think about the absurdity of this scene. Pharaoh orders all Hebrew babies to die in the Nile, and the Nile gives back exactly one, straight into Pharaoh's palace. The instrument of death becomes an instrument of salvation. The river that should have been a tomb becomes a cradle. And the boy who should have died as a slave will grow up as a prince, with access to the best military, political, and administrative education in the ancient world. Acts 7:22 says that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. But Moses, at 40 years old, makes a mistake that changes his life. He sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew and kills the Egyptian. The crime is discovered, and the prince of Egypt flees to the desert of Midian, where he spends the next 40 years tending sheep. 40 years, from general to shepherd, from a palace of marble and gold to goatskin tents in the middle of nowhere. Moses, at 80 years old, probably thought his story was over, that he would be just a footnote, the Hebrew who almost was someone, and then a bush catches fire and does not burn. Exodus 3. Moses approaches, and from the midst of the flame, a voice: I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. The same God, the same promise. 430 years of silence, and now, in that burning bush in the middle of the desert, the project restarts. I have indeed seen the misery of my people. I have come down to rescue them, and I am sending you. Moses tries to refuse. He stammers. He says he doesn't know how to speak. He asks God to send someone else. But God doesn't take no for an answer, and here begins the most spectacular confrontation between the divine and the human that the ancient world has ever seen. The 10 plagues of Egypt were not random punishments. Each plague directly attacked an Egyptian god. The water of the Nile turns to blood, a direct attack on Hapi, the god of the Nile. The frogs, Heket, the goddess with the head of a frog. The darkness, Ra, the sun god, the supreme deity of Egypt, simply switched off for 3 days. What God was doing was not just liberating a people. He was dismantling, piece by piece, the entire religious system of Egypt, showing that every god Pharaoh worshipped was powerless before the God of a bunch of slaves. And the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. On that night, the Hebrews receive a strange instruction: kill a lamb, put the blood on the doorframes, and beat inside the house. The angel of death passes through all the land of Egypt. Every firstborn dies, from the son of Pharaoh on the throne to the son of the prisoner in the dungeon. But where there was blood on the doorframe, death passed over. In Hebrew, Pesach, Passover, to pass over. That same night, Pharaoh sends the Hebrews away. Exodus 12:37, 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Scholars estimate somewhere between 2 and 3 million people leaving Egypt at once. The largest mass escape in ancient history. No logistics, no planning. An entire nation walking into the desert with bread that didn't have time to rise and the promise of a land that none of them had ever seen. And when Pharaoh changes his mind and sends his 600 war chariots after them, the people find themselves cornered between the greatest army in the world and the Red Sea. No way out, no weapons, no chance by any human calculation. Moses raises his staff. The waters open, and 2 million people cross the seabed on dry land. When the Egyptians try to follow, the waters return. Exodus 14:28. Not one of them survived. This scene is the founding moment of Israel. Everything that comes after, the law, the temple, the kings, the prophets, the exile, the restoration, everything is anchored in this moment. The moment when a people of slaves walks through the bottom of the sea and comes out the other side free. It is the event that Jews have celebrated for over 3,000 years without interruption. And it is from here that history really begins to accelerate, because God didn't take these people out of Egypt for a walk. He took them out to lead them to a mountain in the middle of the desert where something would happen that would change human civilization forever. Except that between freedom and the promise, there was a desert. And what happened in that desert revealed something about human nature that is as true today as it was 3,500 years ago. 3 months after crossing the Red Sea, the Hebrews arrive at the foot of Mount Sinai, and what happens there has no parallel in any other religious tradition of the ancient world. Exodus 19 describes the scene. The entire mountain trembles. A thick, dark cloud covers the peak. Lightning bolts cut through the sky. Thunder so loud that the ground vibrates underfoot. And then, a sound. The text says the blast of a trumpet that starts low and grows louder and louder until the whole people recoiled in terror. It was not a natural phenomenon. It was not a storm. It was the physical, tangible presence of the Creator God descending onto a mountain in the middle of the Sinai desert. And it is in this setting, smoke, fire, the earth shaking, that God delivers to Moses the tablets of the law. The 10 Commandments, 10 phrases that would fit on a single page of a notebook, and that became the moral foundation for half of human civilization. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not give false testimony. You recognize these phrases because they are inscribed in the legal DNA of the West. The civil code of practically every democratic country on earth has roots in those words engraved in stone 3,500 years ago. on a mountain where no one lived. But the law was not just the 10 Commandments. The complete package, what the Jews call the Torah, contains 613 commandments, rules about diet, hygiene, social justice, property, marriage, worship, agriculture. Leviticus and Deuteronomy go into details that seem obsessive to the modern reader. How to treat leprosy, what to do with an ox that gores a neighbor, when to plant, and when to let the land rest. It sounds like divine bureaucracy until you understand what was happening. Those people had just come out of 430 years of slavery. They had no government. They had no constitution. They had no identity beyond shared suffering. And God, at Sinai, is building a nation from scratch. Every law, every rule, every ritual was a brick in the foundation of a people who needed to learn how to live as free humans. And while Moses was up there, at the top of the mountain, receiving these instructions for 40 days and 40 nights, what did the people do down below? Exodus 32. They gathered all the gold they had, earrings, rings, bracelets brought from Egypt, melted it all down and molded a golden calf, and they began to worship it. These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. 40 days. It only took 40 days without seeing Moses for a people who had seen the sea open, who had eaten manna falling from the sky every morning, who had seen the cloud of God over the mountain, to return to the exact same type of idolatry they practiced in Egypt. When Moses comes down and sees that, he breaks the tablets of the law. He throws them on the ground. The stones that God had written with his own finger shattered at the base of the mountain. And on that day, 3,000 men die. This scene is brutal. It is uncomfortable. But it reveals something that the Bible never tries to hide. The people chosen by God are not a people better than the others. It is a stubborn, rebellious people who forget quickly and complain even faster. And this pattern, blessing, disobedience, consequence, restoration, will repeat like a metronome throughout the history that follows. God could have ended everything right there. The text says he considered it. Exodus 32:10. Now leave me alone, so that my anger may burn against them, and that I may destroy them. But Moses intercedes. He argues. He reminds God of the promise made to Abraham, and God relents. The Hebrew word is nacham, which means something closer to changing course, and the project continues. New tablets are carved. The tabernacle is built. An elaborate tent with linen curtains, acacia poles overlaid with gold, a bronze altar, and at the center of it all, the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object in Jewish history, containing the tablets of the law. The presence of God dwells there, visible as a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night. When the cloud moved, the people marched. When the cloud stopped, the people camped. 2 million people in the desert, following a cloud. And then comes the decisive moment. Numbers chapter 13. The people are at the border of Canaan, the promised land. It is right there, just ahead. Moses sends 12 spies to scout the land. They spend 40 days exploring. They return with grapes so large that it takes 2 people to carry a cluster on a pole. The land was everything God had promised. Fertile, rich, abundant. But 10 of the 12 spies panic. There are giants there, fortified cities. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes. And people believe the 10, not the 2, Joshua and Caleb, who said, if the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land. Fear conquered faith, and the consequence is devastating. Numbers 14:34. For 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days you explored the land, you will suffer for your sins. 40 years wandering in desert. A slow death sentence. That entire generation, every adult who had come out of Egypt, who had seen the plagues, who had crossed the sea, would die in the desert without setting foot in the promised land. Except for 2, Joshua and Caleb, the only ones who believed. And there, in the desert, an entire generation dies, including Moses himself. Deuteronomy 34 tells of his final moments. God takes him to the top of Mount Nebo on the eastern bank of the Jordan River and shows him the entire land, from north to south, from the Jordan to the Mediterranean. This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it. Moses sees it, but he does not enter. The man who faced Pharaoh, who opened the sea, who received the law of God face to face, dies there a few kilometers from the destination, looking from afar at everything that was promised. Deuteronomy 34:6 says that God himself buried him, and no one knows where his grave is to this day. It is now up to Joshua, Moses' disciple, the spy who was not afraid, to lead this people into Canaan. And the entry is as spectacular as the exit from Egypt. Joshua chapter 3. The priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant step into the waters of the Jordan River, which was at flood stage, and the river stops. It simply stops. The waters pile up upstream, and the riverbed dries up. The people cross on dry ground, just like at the Red Sea. As if God was saying, "What I did with Moses, I will do with Joshua. I have not changed." And then comes Jericho, the first city. Walls so wide that there were houses built inside them. And the military strategy God gives Joshua is, by human standards, insane. March around the city once a day for 6 days. On the 7th day, march 7 times, and then shout. Joshua 6:20. The wall collapsed. Archaeologists who excavated Tel es Sultan, the site identified as Jericho, found walls that collapsed outward, not inward, as would be expected in a conventional attack. The bricks fell, forming a natural ramp that would allow the attackers to cross straight into the city. The conquest of Canaan took approximately 7 years. Joshua leads campaign after campaign. Ai, Gibeon, Hazor, the southern and northern coalitions. The land is divided among the 12 tribes. Each tribe receives its territory. Judah in the south, Ephraim and Manasseh in the center, Dan, Naphtali, and Asher in the north. The promise made to Abraham more than 600 years earlier finally begins to take geographical shape. But Joshua dies, and with him dies the generation that saw the miracles of the conquest. Judges 2:10 records the saddest phrase of this entire period. Another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel, and thus begins the most chaotic, violent, and disconcerting period in the history of Israel, the Judges. The book of Judges is a downward spiral, a vicious cycle that repeats with mechanical precision. The people abandon God. God allows an enemy to oppress them. The people cry out for help. God raises up a judge, a charismatic military leader who delivers them. There is peace for a generation, and then the people abandon God again. And the cycle restarts, worse with every turn. The judges are not conventional heroes. Ehud is a left-handed assassin who plunges a dagger into the belly of a king so fat that the fat closes over the blade. Deborah is a prophetess who leads Israel into war when no man has the courage to go. Gideon starts with an army of 32,000, and God orders it reduced to 300, so that no one thinks the victory was human. Jephthah makes a thoughtless vow that costs him his own daughter. And Samson, the most famous of all, is a man of supernatural strength and disastrous character who wastes his calling chasing Philistine women and ends up blind, chained, grinding grain like an animal before bringing down the temple of Dagon upon himself and 3,000 Philistines. The last sentence of the book of Judges summarizes it all. Judges 21:25. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. It is the portrait of a nation in moral collapse, without central leadership, without unity, each tribe looking out for itself. And it is in this vacuum that the people make the request that changes everything. 1 Samuel chapter 8. The elders of Israel go to the prophet Samuel, the last judge, a man who served God since he was a child, and say, "Appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." Samuel is indignant. God is disappointed. Because what the people are saying, between the lines, is, "We don't want to be governed by God. We want to be like everyone else." And God says to Samuel, "It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king." Even so, God allows it. And the first king of Israel is named Saul. Saul looked perfect on paper, tall, handsome, from the tribe of Benjamin. 1 Samuel 9:2 says that he was a head taller than any of the others. But Saul is the classic example of someone who has the appearance of a leader without having the interior. He starts well, wins battles, unifies tribes, but quickly he begins to disobey. He offers sacrifices that were not his to offer. He spares the Amalekite king when God ordered everything destroyed. And with every disobedience, every shortcut, every decision moved by fear and pride, Saul begins to disintegrate. Samuel's phrase in 1 Samuel 15:23 is like a death sentence. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, because you have rejected the word of the Lord. He has rejected you as king. And while Saul falls apart, God is already looking elsewhere. To a small town called Bethlehem, to the house of a man named Jesse, to the most unlikely of candidates. When Samuel arrives at Jesse's house to anoint the next king, Jesse presents 7 sons, tall, strong, impressive. Samuel looks at the oldest and thinks, "Surely the Lord's anointed stands here." But God says the phrase that defines the entire theology of biblical leadership: "Do not consider his appearance or his height." The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. None of the 7 is the chosen one. Samuel asks, "Are these all the sons you have?" And Jesse, almost as if apologizing, says, "There is still the youngest. He is tending the sheep." They didn't even call the boy to the meeting. His own father didn't consider him a candidate. David arrives from the field, smelling like sheep, with calloused hands and a sunburned face. And Samuel pours the oil over his head. The shepherd boy is the anointed of God. And then comes the scene that even those who have never opened a Bible know. The valley of Elah, the Philistines on one side, Israel on the other, and between the two armies, a giant, Goliath of Gath. 1 Samuel 17 gives the measurements: 6 cubits and a span, somewhere between 9 feet 6 inches and 10 feet tall. His armor weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze, about 125 pounds. Just the tip of his spear weighed 15 pounds. For 40 days, this man came out morning and evening and challenged Israel. And for 40 days, no one moved, not even the king. And who steps forward? The boy who wasn't even called to the meeting in Bethlehem. Without armor, without a sword, with 5 smooth stones from the stream and a shepherd's sling. Saul tries to put his armor on David. It doesn't work, it doesn't fit. And perhaps that is the point. The armor of the old system does not fit what God is doing anew. The stone hits Goliath in the forehead. The giant falls face down on the ground. And that shepherd boy becomes the greatest king Israel has ever known. But David's rise is not immediate. Saul goes mad with jealousy. He tries to kill David with a spear twice. David flees. He lives as a fugitive in the desert of Judah, hiding in caves, leading a band of 400 men who were distressed, and discontented, the outcasts of Israel. And it is in those years of flight, in those cold nights inside caves, where the darkness was so thick you couldn't see your own hand, that David writes the deepest psalms of the Bible. "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing." Psalm 23 was not written in a palace. It was written by a man who slept on a stone floor with a price on his head. Saul dies in battle on Mount Gilboa, falling on his own sword after being wounded by Philistine archers. And David finally takes the throne, first over Judah in Hebron, then over all Israel. and his first great decision as a unified king is a stroke of political and spiritual genius that will define the history of the world. He conquers Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a Jebusite fortress, nestled between valleys, in a position so high and so well defended that its inhabitants mocked David. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off. 2 Samuel 5-6. But David takes the city through a water tunnel, a vertical shaft that his men climbed from the inside, and transforms that pagan fortress into the eternal capital of Israel, the city of David. Then he brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem with such joy that he himself dances before it in the street, wearing only a linen ephod, while the people shout and the trumpets sound. And it is here that God makes to David the second great unconditional promise of the Bible. 2 Samuel 7:16, "Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." Forever. Not for a generation, not for a century, forever. This promise, the Davidic covenant, is the track upon which all of Israel's messianic expectations will run for the next 1,000 years. Every prophet who speaks of a future Savior will point to this promise. Every Jew who waits for a Messiah will wait for a son of David. But David, the man after God's own heart, is also the man who, one afternoon in Jerusalem, looks from the palace roof and sees a woman bathing. Bathsheba, wife of Uriah, one of his most loyal soldiers, who at that moment was on the front lines risking his life for the king. David calls her, sleeps with her, she becomes pregnant, and when the attempt to cover it up fails, David orders Uriah to be placed at the front of the most dangerous battle, and then has the support withdrawn. Uriah dies, and David marries Bathsheba as if nothing had happened. The prophet Nathan goes to David and tells a parable about a rich man who steals a poor man's only lamb. David is enraged. The man who did this deserves to die. And Nathan strikes, "You are the man." 2 Samuel 12:7. The Bible does not protect its heroes. The greatest king of Israel is exposed as an adulterer and a murderer in his own scriptures, and the consequences haunt the house of David for the rest of his days. The child dies, Amnon violates Tamar, Absalom revolts and tries to take the throne. The sword never departs from the house of David. David dies old and passes the throne to Solomon, his son, with Bathsheba. And Solomon begins with something extraordinary. When God appears and says, "Ask for whatever you want," Solomon does not ask for wealth, nor power, nor victory. He asks for wisdom. 1 Kings 3:9, "Give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people." And God, impressed by the request, gives him everything, wisdom and wealth and glory. And it is Solomon who finally builds what David dreamed of, the Temple of Jerusalem. 7 years of construction. 1 Kings 6 details the dimensions: 60 cubits long, 20 wide, 30 high, about 90 feet by 30 by 45. The inner walls lined with cedar from Lebanon. The cedar covered with pure gold. The Holy of Holies, the innermost room where the ark would stay, was a perfect cube of gold. Cherubim 15 feet high with open wings touching the walls, 183,000 workers. And when the ark is finally placed in the Holy of Holies, 1 Kings 8:10-11 describes what happens. The cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. The promise made in the Sinai desert, "I dwell among the Israelites," now had an address: stone, cedar, and gold, Jerusalem. But Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, makes the oldest mistake in the world. 1 Kings 11:1-3, 700 wives and 300 concubines, princesses of pagan nations, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, Hittites, political marriages, diplomatic alliances sealed with rings and beds, and these women brought their gods. And Solomon in his old age, his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. The builder of the temple ends up burning incense to Ashtoreth and Moloch. The man who asked for wisdom dies a fool, and the consequence is immediate. God announces the kingdom will be torn away, not during Solomon's life, for the sake of David, but in the reign of his son. And that is exactly what happens. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, takes the throne. The northern tribes asked for relief from Solomon's brutal taxes. The old advisors say, lighten the load. The young advisors say, increase it. Rehoboam listens to the young men, and he says to the people, with an arrogance that would echo for centuries, my father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. 10 tribes rebel. The kingdom splits in half. Israel in the north, with its capital in Samaria, Judah in the south, with its capital in Jerusalem. They would never be reunited. God's project, one nation, one people, one land, was fractured. And from here, history accelerates toward disaster with a speed that no prophet could slow down. The northern kingdom, Israel, starts poorly and never improves. Jeroboam, the first king, is afraid that the people will keep going up to Jerusalem to worship at the temple. If they go to Jerusalem, he thought, their hearts will return to the house of David, and his solution is as predictable as it is catastrophic. 1 Kings 12:28. He makes 2 golden calves, one in Dan in the far north, another in Bethel in the far south, and he says to the people, here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. The same phrase, word for word. The same phrase the people used at Sinai when Aaron cast the calf while Moses was on the mountain. As if history had learned to walk in circles. And this decision by Jeroboam becomes the foundational sin of the northern kingdom. From then on, every king is measured by the same criterion. He walked in the ways of Jeroboam son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin. 19 kings ruled the northern kingdom over 209 years. None received divine approval, not one. And it is in this setting of total corruption that the most dramatic prophets of the Bible rise. Elijah appears out of nowhere, no genealogy, no introduction, and announces to Ahab, the most wicked king of the north, married to Jezebel, the Phoenician princess who imported the worship of Baal into the heart of Israel. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except, at my word, 3.5 years without a drop of rain, the earth cracked, the cattle dying, and then comes the confrontation on Mount Carmel, 1 Kings 18. Elijah against 450 prophets of Baal, one altar, one sacrifice, and a question that cuts like a razor. How long will you waver between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him. The prophets of Baal dance, shout, and sash themselves with knives from morning until afternoon. Nothing happens. Elijah orders the altar to be drenched with water, 3 times 12 jars, until the water filled the trench around it. And then he prays. A short prayer without theater, and fire falls from heaven. It doesn't just burn the sacrifice, it consumes the wood, the stones, the soil, and licks up the water in the trench. The people fall face down. The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. But neither Elijah nor Elisha, who succeeded him with double his spirit and performed all the miracles, raised the dead, purified waters, healed Naaman the leprous Syrian general, nor the prophets Amos and Hosea, who pleaded for justice and repentance, could reverse the fall. The northern kingdom was a structure supported by idols, and idols support nothing. In 722 BC, the end arrives. Assyria, the most brutal empire of antiquity, famous for impaling prisoners, skinning them alive, and building pyramids of severed heads, invades Israel. Shalmaneser V besieges Samaria. Siege lasts 3 years. When the city falls, his successor Sargon II completes the destruction. 2 Kings 17:6. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria. 27,200 people were deported, according to Sargon's own records in the palace of Khorsabad. And in their place, the Assyrians brought peoples from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, and Hamath. They mixed populations, they diluted identity. The 10 northern tribes disappear from history as a political entity. Absorbed, assimilated, the so-called lost tribes of Israel. Judah remains, alone, small, with the temple, with Jerusalem, with the promise made to David. And for a time it seems Judah will survive where Israel failed, because Judah has something the north never had: good kings, not many, but enough to delay the collapse. Hezekiah, who rules at the exact moment of the north's fall, is one of them. 2 Kings 18:5 says that there was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. When Sennacherib, the Syrian king, marches on Judah with 185,000 soldiers, besieges Jerusalem, and sends a letter blaspheming God, Hezekiah opens the letter in the temple, spreads it out before the Lord, and prays. That night, 2 Kings 19:35, the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. In the morning, only dead bodies. Sennacherib returns to Nineveh humiliated. And in the Assyrian annals, the Taylor Prism, which exists to this day in the British Museum, Sennacherib boasts of having trapped Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. But he never says he took Jerusalem, because he didn't. After Hezekiah, however, comes Manasseh, his own son. And Manasseh rules for 55 years, the longest reign in Judah, and every one of those years is an atrocity. 2 Kings 21 is a catalogue of horrors. He rebuilt the pagan altars his father had demolished. He erected altars to Baal inside the temple. He placed an Asherah pole in the place reserved exclusively for the presence of God. He practiced sorcery, divination, and necromancy. And verse 16 says, shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from end to end. Jewish tradition states it was Manasseh who ordered the prophet Isaiah to be sawn in half, inside a hollow log. 55 years, more than half a century, systematically undoing everything his father had built. And 2 Kings 21:13 records the sentence, I will stretch over Jerusalem the measuring line used against Samaria and the plumb line used against the house of Ahab. What happened to the north will happen to the south. The only difference now is time. Josiah tried to reverse fate. The last good king. He takes the throne at 8 years old, and at 26, he orders the restoration of the temple. And during the work, the high priest Hilkiah finds something in the ruins, the book of the law. Probably Deuteronomy, or a large part of the Torah. It had been lost. The people of God had lost the scriptures of God. When they read the book before Josiah, the king tears his clothes, because he understands, reading the curses and the promises, the size of the abyss between what God asked and what the people did. Josiah leads the most radical reform in Judah's history. He destroys pagan altars. He burns the objects of Baal worship. He profanes the high places. He celebrates the Passover for the first time in centuries. 2 Kings 23:22 says that neither in the days of the judges was any such Passover observed, but it is too late. 2 Kings 23:26 is one of the coldest phrases in the entire Bible. Nevertheless, the Lord did not turn away from the heat of his fierce anger, which burned against Judah because of all that Manasseh had done to arouse his anger. Uzziah fixed the present, but the past had already signed the sentence. Josiah dies in 609 BC, trying to intercept Pharaoh Necho of Egypt at the Battle of Megiddo. Yes, Megiddo. the same place that in Greek is called Armageddon. And after him, everything crumbles in slow motion. 4 kings in 22 years, each worse than the last, all puppets of foreign powers. And it is in this final chaos that a voice rises with more clarity and more pain than any other. Jeremiah. Called while still a teenager. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Jeremiah spends 40 years preaching the same message no one wants to hear. Babylon is coming. Repent or lose everything. He cries so much he is called the weeping prophet. He is imprisoned, thrown into a muddy cistern, and threatened with death. His own relatives conspire against him, and no one listens, no one. In 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, the young and brilliant Babylonian general, defeats Egypt at Carchemish and takes control of the entire Fertile Crescent. Judah becomes a vassal. The first wave of deportees goes to Babylon, among them a young noble named Daniel. In 597, Nebuchadnezzar returns. He loots the temple. He takes more deportees, among them the priest Ezekiel. And in 586 BC, when King Zedekiah rebels, Nebuchadnezzar comes for the last time, and this time he doesn't come to loot, he comes to destroy. The siege of Jerusalem lasts 18 months. Lamentations of Jeremiah describes what happens inside. Mothers cooking their own children, people licking the walls in search of moisture, princes unrecognizable, with skin sticking to their bones. On the 9th day of the 4th month, the walls are breached. Zedekiah tries to flee at night through the gate between the 2 walls, near the king's garden. He is captured on the plains of Jericho, taken to Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah. And the last thing Zedekiah's eyes see before being gouged out is the execution of his own sons. 2 Kings 25:7. On the 7th day of the 5th month, August 586, Nebuzaradan, the captain of Nebuchadnezzar's guard, enters Jerusalem and burns everything. Solomon's temple, 410 years of existence. Cedar of Lebanon, gold. The Ark of the Covenant, which simply disappears from biblical records at this point, never to be mentioned again. The house where the glory of God descended like a cloud. It turned to ash. The walls are demolished, the city razed, and the people are led in chains to Babylon. Psalm 137 captures the pain of this moment with an honesty that cuts. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? But here something happens that no other people of antiquity managed to do. The Egyptians lost their civilization. The Assyrians disappeared. The Babylonians would be absorbed. The Philistines, the Moabites, the Ammonites, all dissolved into the dust of history. But the Jews, sitting by the rivers of Babylon, without a temple, without land, without a king, without sacrifices, they survived. They didn't just survive. They were transformed. The synagogue is born in exile. The systematic compilation and preservation of scriptures intensify in exile. Jewish identity stops depending on the place and starts depending on the text, on the book, on the word. The exile that should have been the end was paradoxically the moment when Israel became indestructible. Because you can burn a temple, you can demolish walls, you can raise a city, but you cannot destroy an idea that an entire people has memorized. If this story gives you chills, comment, indestructible. And God had not forgotten. Isaiah, who prophesied more than a century before the exile, had already given the name of the liberator. Isaiah 44:28 and 45:1, who says of Cyrus, "He is my shepherd and will accomplish all that I please." This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of. Cyrus, the Persian, a pagan king called by name my God, more than 100 years before he was born. In 539 BC, Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon without shedding a drop of blood. He diverts the course of the Euphrates River, and his soldiers enter the city gates through the dry riverbed, while the Babylonians are feasting. And in his first year, he issues the decree recorded both in the Bible and on the Cyrus cylinder, which is in the British Museum today. The deported peoples can return. The Jews can rebuild their temple. Ezra 1:3. Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem, and may their God be with them. 42,360 people returned. Ezra 2:64 gives the exact number. Not everyone. Most stayed in Babylon. They already had houses, businesses, lives. But the remnant returns, and they start from zero. The second temple is built. Smaller, simpler. The old men who saw the first one weep because it doesn't compare. Haggai 2:3. Who of you is left who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Does it not seem to you like nothing? But God promises through Haggai, the glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house. And it is Nehemiah who rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem in 52 days, a feat that left the surrounding enemies terrified because they recognized that only God could have done it so fast. The nation had returned. The temple was standing. The walls were raised. But something was missing. The cloud of glory did not descend upon the second temple. The ark was not there. The fire from heaven did not fall. And with Malachi, the last prophet, came the silence. The last prophetic words of the Old Testament, and then God went quiet for 400 years. 400 years without a prophet. 400 years without a direct word from God. Scholars call it the intertestamental period. Believers call it the silence of God. But silence does not mean inactivity. In those 4 centuries, the world is transformed to prepare the stage for the final act. Alexander the Great conquers everything, from Egypt to India, and spreads the Greek language throughout the known world. He dies at 32, his empire shatters, and the land of Israel becomes disputed spoils between the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria. And in 167 BC, the unthinkable happens. Antiochus IV, Epiphanes invades the temple, and his soldiers drag a pig to the altar, the same altar where incense rose to God, and sacrifice it there. Unclean animal blood flowing over consecrated stone. A statue of Zeus erected in the Holy of Holies. Daniel 11:31 had already predicted it, the abomination that causes desolation. And from this profanation, the Maccabean revolt is born, a family of priests led by Judas Maccabeus, who, against all probability, defeat the Seleucid army and reconquer Jerusalem. The purification of the temple in 164 BC is celebrated to this day as Hanukkah. The Maccabees found the Hasmonean dynasty, and for a brief moment, Israel has independence again, for the first time since Babylon. But the Hasmoneans quickly become corrupt. Kings who were priests, priests who were generals, brothers who murdered brothers for the throne. And in 63 BC, when 2 Hasmonean brothers fight for power, one of them makes the fatal mistake of asking Rome for help. General Pompey marches on Jerusalem, enters the Holy of Holies, something only the high priest could do once a year, looks around and leaves. From that day on, Israel belongs to Rome. And in 37 BC, Rome places on the throne of Judea a man who was not Jewish, not loved, and not sane, Herod the Great, an Idumean by birth, descended from Esau, not Jacob. Herod rebuilds the temple on a scale that would make Solon pale. The courtyard was so large, a soccer stadium could fit inside. But he rules by terror. He kills 3 of his own sons. He kills the wife he loved. Caesar Augustus is said to have remarked, "It is safer to be Herod's pig than Herod's son." And it is during the reign of this paranoid man, in a peripheral province of an empire that stretched from Britain to the Euphrates, on a random night of a year that historians place between 6 and 4 BC, that a Jewish teenager named Mary, in a stable in Bethlehem, the same little town David came from, gives birth to a boy. Lucas 2:7. And she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger, because there was no guest room available for them. Micah 5:2 had prophesied 700 years earlier, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times." The promise made to Abraham, "In you all the families of the earth will be blessed." The promise made to David, "Your throne will be established forever." 2,000 years of history converge on a manger, on a newborn crying in the cold night of a town so small it almost doesn't appear on the map. This is the God of Israel. He doesn't arrive on a war horse, he arrives in a cradle of straw. And from that manger everything changes. 30 years in silence, and then 3 years that split history in half. A Galilean carpenter who walked with fishermen and tax collectors, who touched lepers, who stopped in the middle of a crowd to hear a blind man shout, who wept before a tomb and said, "I am the resurrection and the life," who entered Jerusalem riding a donkey, not a war horse, while the people spread cloaks and shouted Hosanna to the Son of David, and who, on a Friday, outside the walls of that same Jerusalem that David conquered, that Solomon filled with gold, that Nebuchadnezzar burned, and that Herod rebuilt, was nailed to a Roman cross between 2 thieves. The veil of the temple was torn from top to bottom. That veil that separated the Holy of Holies, the place where only the high priest entered, once a year, with animal blood, tore by itself. As if God were saying, "The separation is over." 3 days later, the tomb was empty, and 500 people saw the man who had been crucified walking, talking, eating fish by a lake. In 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the Second Temple. 1 wall remained, a single western wall that stands to this day, where millions go to weep and pray every year. The Jews were scattered among all the nations of the earth, exactly as Moses had warned in Deuteronomy 28. Persecuted in every century. Inquisition, pogroms, Holocaust, 6 million. And in 1948, after 1,900 years without a homeland, the state of Israel is reborn in a single day. Exactly as Isaiah 66:8 asked, "Can a country be born in a day?" From Abraham to 1948. From a tent in the desert to a flag at the UN. 4,000 years, and the thread never broke. This is the story of Israel. It is not the story of a people who were good enough to deserve God's protection. It is the story of a God who made a promise, and who kept it despite everything, despite disobedience, exile, fire, and blood. Because the promise never depended on the people. It depended on the one who promised. And if this story made sense to you, click on the next one appearing on your screen. I prepared it for those who made it this far.